Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever it is you're joining us from. And welcome to the third in our series of legal considerations for high growth startups. It's a partnership between Fourthly and Foley and Laudner. So today's discussion point is M&A for startup founders. So you create a company, you get it going, you get great success, and then one day somebody offers to buy you. And so, what are the considerations that you should think about as a startup founder if you review an acquisition offer? I'm Brett Waters. I've been in Silicon Valley my entire life, started and run a few companies. Today, I'm all in on helping other entrepreneurs. So, I teach entrepreneurship at Stanford University. I coach startup CEOs at the Miller Center for Social Entrepreneurship, and I run the Fourthly Startup Accelerator. And joining me this morning for this conversation about this particular topic is, first of all, Eric. Eric, good morning.
Good morning, Brett. How are you?
I'm okay. Where are you joining us from today?
I am joining you from Palo Alto. I wish
Palo
I
Alto.
have a more exciting answer, but I don't.
You know, the heart of Silicon Valley.
Absolutely.
So, Eric, give us the brief background around yourself.
Sure. I'm a senior counsel at Foley and Lardner's Palo Alto office, and my practice focus mainly on M&As. That would be my bread and butter, with a splash of the typical Bay Area corporate transactions. Other types of transactions, for example, venture financings, or even general corporate counseling work. But I would say by far my bread and butter and my interest lies with M&A.
Terrific. Well, then you're the right person to be on this panel. Also joining us is Brandy. Morning, Brandy.
Hi, how are you?
Well, I'm okay. So, where are you joining us from today?
So I am with Foley's San Francisco office.
There we go.
Yeah, and I've been practicing M&A for close to 20 years now. I originally started out as a general practitioner. One of the first things I did, of course, was help entrepreneurs start and form their business. One of my first clients, actually, within a few years after helping them start and fund their business, sold it for about $500 million. And when I did that, I was hooked. I said, this is what I want to be doing. I want to help companies with their exits. And so now my focus is 100% on M&A.
Well, that's terrific. That's terrific. So, I'd like to invite our audience to, if you have questions for our panelists today, just put them right there in the chat box, and we'll get to them. So, and also give us an idea where you're calling from. I'm interested in where our various attendees are as they're joining us today. So Eric and Brandy. I've been through this process a couple times myself of, founding a company, and it's my passion for 2 or 5 or 10 years, and then finally one day it seems like maybe it's time to consider a acquisition offer. And that moment is kind of an emotional one for many startup founders because this is your baby. And you have a whole bunch of things on your mind. You've got obviously your own personal outcomes from a transaction in mind, but you're concerned about the employees. You're concerned about the customers. You're concerned about going into a transaction that doesn't end up closing, which can be very, very disruptive for the operations of the company. So, what are some of the things that a founder should think about in terms of reviewing a term sheet for a potential acquisition offer? Brandy, if you had a client walk into your office tomorrow and say, "I've got a term sheet for an acquisition," what are the top three things I should think about as I review this? What would your answer be, Brandy?
Sure. Well, usually the top thing that every founder thinks of first and looks for first is the number,
Yeah.
right? So what is the value of my company? And of course, that is a top consideration as you evaluate an offer from a potential purchaser. But there are other things, of course, that are important as well. So it's not only, how much, but when am I going to get it? And do I ever have to give it back? So, so all of those things are important. And then, there will be a number of other things as as a a seller, am I going to continue to remain invested? What other obligations am I going to have? But I'd say top three are really, how much, when do I get it, and do I have to give it back?
Right, right. Eric, anything to add to that?
I agree with 100% with what Brandy just said, and I think to her point about giving money back, that is actually a very important factor that usually a lot of founders pay less attention to compared to the closing consideration that they're given. If we go with a representation of warranties insurance policy, which is quite common nowadays. We can even take a more seller favor approach and try to argue for a complete release in favor of the sellers after the closing, in which case, the sellers, after they sell the company, they can sleep sound at night. And if that is not what was agreed upon, then we need to get into the weeds of indemnification. What's a cap? The
Yeah.
money that sellers get at closing may not be there, so that's very important. And another thing that I would like to add is exclusivity. So a lot of
Yeah.
buyers would require exclusivity to be inserted as a clause to the LOI, given the resources that they'll need to spend on moving the deal forward. And the period really ranges from deal to deal, and it could be 30 days, it could be 60 days, or it could even be longer. But I think the key here is not to accept an auto renewal clause, so that we know that when the time comes, when the company decides that the buyer isn't interested to get this deal done, they won't be subject to an auto renewal clause that prevents them from talking to other buyers.
Right.
A
Right.
lot of times that the letter of intent doesn't have all of this information. Certainly an exclusivity. Every buyer wants an exclusivity. But oftentimes the initial offer that is given to a seller is pretty light on the terms. And so, the buyer will just include the value, how much am I going to pay? And then, of course, they're going to put in some assumptions that go along with that valuation because it gives them wiggle room. It gives them wiggle room to change that valuation after you're in the middle of the process. Even, when you're close to closing, they'll point back to that letter of intent with those assumptions and say, well, I know we said we were going to buy you for 100 million, but we said that our assumption was going to be that you had a certain level of ARR or whatever it may be.
Right.
So as a seller, you're going to want to really take a look and make sure that you flesh out all the things that are important to you, because you are never going to have more leverage than you do before you sign the letter of intent. So it's important to take the time to negotiate the things that are important to you and make sure that, we mitigate the chance of there being any surprises after we sign it and are knee deep in the process.
Right. Right.
Right.
Yeah, I definitely have lived this myself. That you accept an offer that you think is a good one, and so you sign the LOI, which means you now go into the exclusivity period where you're not allowed to talk to any other potential acquirers. Then they start doing the due diligence and they start trying to chip away at the price. And it's kind of frustrating for you as the seller because they're now trying to renegotiate the price based on things that they say they found in the diligence. And meanwhile, you can no longer shop it around. You can no longer see whether somebody else will give you a better price because you're in the exclusivity period. So I guess maybe Brandy, walk us through kind of the process, the typical process. In other words, there's informal conversations that eventually result in an LOI, and then there's some sort of exclusivity, and then sort of walk us through what that process typically looks like.
Yeah, sure. And it depends on your process. So hopefully you've got a lot of options as a seller. I would recommend, every seller talk to an investment banker or another financial advisor to help them with the process, because what they can do for you as a seller is they can go and shop the deal, right? And it's much better for you as a seller to get multiple parties who are interested, because then you've got more power and we've got more leverage.
Sure.
So, hopefully you've gotten someone to help you with that process, to shop the company a little bit. You've ideally got more than one interested party, but if you only have one, that's all you need, right? And so you have some preliminary discussions. Usually you will prepare like a management presentation that will give the high level overview of the company. And then if the buyer is interested, they'll put together this letter of intent, you negotiate it, and you execute it. You would also execute at that time, typically, unless you've got the leverage to avoid it, an exclusivity agreement. The exclusivity agreement guarantees the buyer that you're not going to talk to anyone else. You're not going to try and do another deal during a certain period of time, and that time frame is negotiable. And that could be, depending on how quick could be 14 days to 60 days to 90 days. Those are on the longer end, by the way. And you would also enter into a confidentiality agreement, because of course it's very important to protect your information, because there is going to be a very extensive due diligence process where the buyer is going to be asking you for everything under the sun. And it's a lot of work. And it's a lot of time, and it's really hard to do that and operate your business at the same time, but that's what you're going to have to do. And the buyer will usually take, anywhere from, 3 weeks to 4 weeks, something like that, to do all of its diligence. There'll be multiple requests for information. And then concurrently, there would be a draft acquisition agreement that would be put together and ideally negotiated at the same time, so you keep the process moving as quickly as possible. That's the importance of having a very short, if you do enter into exclusivity, having a short period, because it keeps the pressure on the buyer to move quickly, not drag things out. Time is our enemy. We want this process to go quickly, so there's no surprises, nothing comes up. And the way to do that as a seller is to prepare, right? To prepare even before you get into this process, and that means making sure your financial house is in order, making sure you've got good, clean financial statements, making sure you've got the right advisors. You have a good CFO or outside financial consultant to be helping you be prepared for the process. Maybe getting together your due diligence or data room ahead of time. That saves time and can be a reason why you can negotiate for a shorter exclusivity period, because you can say, look, my data room's ready to go. I don't, you're going to get access to diligence material right away, so we don't need this extended period of time for exclusivity. And then,
I'm old enough. I remember when data rooms were actual physical rooms.
Yes, I do too.
Now a data room is usually a digital repository of some sort.
Yep.
Absolutely. And I'll also add that in the negotiation stage or the diligence stage, there is also a very significant task for the sellers to complete, and that is the disclosure schedules. And that could, take up a significant portion of time and resources that the seller will devote into the deal. So basically what it says is, in the definitive agreement, down the road, there will be 30 to 40 pages of representations and warranties about the operation of the company. And if any of these representations are untrue, the sellers would need to set forth this disclosure in the disclosure schedule to be delivered to the buyer, in order to prevent the buyer from being able to make a claim against his seller after closing under indemnity. So that could be a very long process. And my favorite opening line whenever I get on the first call with a client on the schedules is that I'm probably going to be the least favorite person in the world after this is done. So please bear with me. And that is an interesting process. And after the diligence is completed and the definitive documents are signed, then we can proceed to signing. And at signing, the only thing that I would also consider sellers to think about is what documents are supposed to be delivered at signing. For example, a lot of times buyer would want employment agreements to be delivered by certain individuals deemed key employees, but the seller would need to think about how is that going to interplay with employee communication plans. For example, if none of the employees know about the deal and the buyer wants 20 employees to sign an employment agreement at signing. How is that going to be achieved? So that is also very important. And a lot of times buyers would also ask for a certain number of stockholders to sign jointer agreements saying that they agree to be bound by the terms of the merger agreement and some other documents as well. So we need to think about whether we are confident that we can gather that amount of signatures in a short period of time.
Mm-hmm.
This is why the letter of intent is so important, because we need to understand upfront what's required, right? And we want to try and lay that out and get an agreement upfront, because it can add a lot of delay, right? And we want to make sure that this whole process is a productive one. And the way we know it's productive is if we have alignment between the two parties up front. And so that involves things that, Eric alluded to, like structuring the deal, right? So there are different structures. The letter of intent will probably address that. And that's a really important consideration for a seller, because it has huge implications. It has huge tax implications for the seller, as well as liability implications. And so in the letter of intent, this will be one of the non-binding terms. And just stepping back, I should probably highlight that there are binding terms, there are non-binding terms. So things like this exclusivity agreement, clearly the buyer wants that to be binding. All the material terms of the transaction, even the purchase price, those are technically going to be non-binding. But what's in it, once you have something in the letter of intent or the term sheet, it's really hard to walk back from that. So even though it's non-binding, it's really important to try and lay out the things that are important to us as a seller. So that includes structure, that includes purchase price, that includes how am I getting paid? Is it going to be cash? Is it going to be stock? Right. Is it going to be contingent on certain metrics being met after the closing? Does it require all of these signatures that Eric mentioned, right? So if we have a stock sale, do we want to go out and get every single shareholder to sign a 70-page agreement? Do we want to have our deal contingent on getting signatures from 10, 15 employees to agree to certain employment terms? So the letter of intent is really a key document to make sure that we've got alignment, that we know what to expect following the closing, and that we avoid wasting time and money, because it's a very time-consuming process and very expensive process.
So I think, Brandy, I think part of what you're saying is that I've often seen a company's team accept an LOI, sign an LOI, and then go retain counsel to represent them on the transaction. And part of what you're saying is better to talk to counsel beforehand, because
I do not recommend you sign a letter of intent or a term sheet without getting some advice from legal counsel and tax counsel, frankly, because there's there's not only tax counsel, but maybe as a personal shareholder, you want to make sure that you've talked to your CPA or someone, so how that's going to affect you personally.
Right. I think that's a super important point, and none of us on this panel are tax experts, but I certainly think that anybody who's considering selling their company should, in addition to retaining a good law firm, should also make sure they're getting advice from a good tax person, because the tax outcomes on a transaction like this can vary quite a bit depending on the way in which the transaction is structured.
That's right. And it could be, for instance, sometimes in the term sheet we'll find out that they expect the founder to roll over a portion of their interest, right? And so that means they're not going to get all of the consideration at the closing. Maybe they'll get 60% or 70%, whatever it may be. And then they roll over the rest and stay invested in the company. Well, you don't want to get taxed on that, right? If you're going to roll over some of that consideration, you want to make sure it's done in a tax efficient way, so you don't have to pay Uncle Sam at the closing for something that you didn't get yet.
Right, for sure.
Yeah, and on the topic of tax planning, it's important to note that your lawyers, or the company's lawyer, I should say, represent the company. So while we give advice to the possible tax outcomes in terms of an M&A transaction, the company's lawyers typically don't have specific circumstances of individual stockholders in mind. So if you would like to understand your personal tax situation, you should consider retaining your own tax advisors. And also to Brandy's point about engaging legal counsel earlier on in the process to make sure that the LOI terms are done right. There are actually a lot of benefits with engaging counsel earlier on in the process. For example, we've seen a lot of I shouldn't say a lot. We've seen some of our clients in the past who incorporated company through online resources that are available at no cost or very low cost. And then they've been handling their cap tables and whatnot throughout these few years of operation. And then all of a sudden they come to us. And then we spot a lot of problems. And oftentimes it is very costly and time consuming to fix all these problems before we can get the company to a stage or at a point where it can be sold. And besides that, we also need to consider how the structure is going to affect, the operation. For example, if the buyer wants to structure this M&A transaction as an asset purchase, i.e. they're buying the assets of the company and not the stock, that might trigger anti-assignment provisions in customer contracts, for example. And, all of a sudden, your top 5 customers may have a right to cancel their contracts with you, and that is going to directly impact the value of your company. So engaging counsel earlier in the process will help you understand all these different implications besides, the hard number that you see on the LOI.
That's right. Yeah, Brett, you mentioned you've experienced the unfortunate scenario where they do diligence and then they use it as an excuse to they'll either use it as an excuse to reduce the purchase price, or they'll use it as an excuse to hold back some of the purchase price and keep it in escrow in case something comes from it. So as Eric mentioned, this is, being prepared ahead of time, knowing your own skeletons in your closet and clearing out that closet ahead of time, because you can fix things, right? You can take care of things, most things, in advance of starting the deal process. So that way, the buyer doesn't have to encounter it. They can't use it as an excuse to reduce the purchase price.
Right. So let's say, for example, that you'd made an offer of $44 billion to buy a company.
And then decide you don't want to buy it after all.
Then decide you want to buy it after all. And there's something about fake accounts. Yeah. So, Eric, you mentioned reps and warranties. And, this is something, again, that I've been through before where, you're given this long list of many pages worth of questions where you need to represent and warranty a whole bunch of things. And there'll be questions on there like, have you ever fired someone who might still be mad at you?
Yes.
Like, yeah, maybe. And you mentioned insurance against this, which is actually, honestly, it's not something I'm familiar with. So tell us about that.
Sure. So there is a insurance product available in the market called Reps and Warranties Insurance. And I would say 6, 7, 8 years ago, nobody has heard of that. But the whole policy, the insurance policy scene has become almost a norm for a lot of M&A transactions, at least the bigger ones nowadays. So what it does is the buyer would go to an insurance carrier and say, hey, I want to purchase an insurance policy to cover any breaches of reps that are made by the sellers after the closing in case they suffer a loss as a result. And then the insurer, of course, they will work with the buyer to price the insurance premium, and they will also undergo a very extensive diligence process on their own. So the insurance carrier is going to retain their own counsel, is going to look into the financials of the company, and they will want to make sure that the buyer actually has undergone a robust diligence process. So they'll be talking to the company's counsel, the company's in-house people, to understand how the diligence was done, or what follow-ups or what conclusions were come to after this diligence process. And after the insurance carrier has had a chance to consider the diligence process of the buyer, they will propose a list of excluded items that would be applicable to this particular deal. So a lot of these are still determined on a case-by-case basis. But the idea is by purchasing a reps and warranties insurance policy, the buyer would not have to go back to the sellers
Right.
after the closing for any claims. And that can be beneficial in a lot of ways. First of all, it would be easier for the buyer to make a claim against, a big name instead of some individual stockholders.
Yeah.
Secondly, and this is probably more relevant to strategic buyers, if a strategic buyer buys a company for strategic reasons, they have every incentive to make sure that the employees are happy, and the
Sure.
employees are more commonly than not some of the stockholders.
Right.
And
Right.
typically, making a claim against your own employees is not a good way to make sure your employees are
Right.
happy.
Right.
So
Right.
by opting for a reps and warranties insurance policy, we can mitigate this risk as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And,
And
and
for
is the cost of that paid by buyer, seller, or both? What's the typical agreement on that?
I would say it's usually paid by the buyer, although technically that's negotiable.
Yeah. And for the seller, it's a huge deal, not just in the post-closing liability aspect, but also how much money am I going to get at the closing?
Right.
Because if you don't have rep and warranty policy, unless a buyer is willing to self-insure and not go after you, they are going to request some sort of escrow or holdback, and that could be anywhere from 5 to 20%. Usually 10% is kind of where we see it. And that's 10% you don't get at closing, and you won't get for a year or two. And it's subject to claims. But if you've got this rep and warranty policy, you can get all your cash at closing, except maybe a very small amount if the buyer's expecting you to fund the retention amount on the insurance policy.
So I remember, this is probably before you two were born, but I remember, so there's a time when the personal finance software market was kind of shared by Intuit, had Quicken, which was the leading consumer finance product at the time, and then Microsoft had a program called Microsoft Money. And this is back when you bought packaged software, right? And so Microsoft Money and Intuit Quicken were the two leading players. And Microsoft made an acquisition offer to buy Intuit. And Scott Cook, the founder and CEO of Intuit, accepted the offer, and they went down the road. And Scott was smart enough to negotiate a breakup fee just in case the deal didn't go through. And sure enough, 60 days or so into the transaction, the government blocked the deal because it was anti-competitive, because these were the two leading providers. And so because the deal got blocked, Scott Cook and Intuit received a $25 million breakup fee from Microsoft, and then used that money to basically obliterate Microsoft Money from the market. And today, Intuit, of course, absolutely rules that whole that whole segment. So, breakup fees. Talk to us about when breakup fees are appropriate to negotiate, and your thoughts about that.
Well, Eric can chime in as well, but there's different reasons why they may be in place, and there are breakup fees that are put on the seller, but there's also reverse breakup fees as well that are sometimes put on the buyer, and so they're usually there because there's some sort of risk, right? Some sort of risk associated with getting the deal done, and one of the parties doesn't want to end up losing all of the expense of there's a lot of transaction expenses, but sometimes it goes beyond that, right? It's more than just a transaction expense.
Well, it can be, you can lose a lot of momentum in the organization, because even though you're trying to do this in a way that is, kept quiet, eventually the word gets out, and now all the employees know that the company is about to be sold. All the customers know the company is about to be sold. All the vendors of the company is about to be sold. And so, there's a lot of organizational momentum that can be lost by entering into an agreement like this. And when it suddenly falls apart, it can take a while to get the momentum back.
Yeah. And so there are triggers for that, I think, which is where you were getting to. And so, one trigger might be if it's on the seller, it might be because the seller has an out right? So maybe they've negotiated the ability to get out of the deal, to get out of their exclusivity if they get a better offer. They're trying to comply with their fiduciary duties as a board. So that's
Right.
kind of the common scenario. And you see that more often in the public company deals than in the private company deals. But there could be other reasons. There could be other triggers. As a seller, maybe you put it in because you've decided to go with this particular buyer over another because you like their deal, but maybe there's more risk to it because they're competitive with you, and you have a risk that the deal won't get done because you won't get clearance. Or maybe it'll take a long time to get clearance, and that results in more expense. So there are, reverse breakup fees where you can expect the buyer to pay you if the deal isn't done because you don't get HSR clearance, or maybe the buyer is financing the deal. So that's an important part to consider too.
Right.
As a
Finance.
seller, yeah. Am I going to get paid?
There are deals that fall apart just because the seller thought they had financing lined up and they turned out it didn't come through.
That's right. So if they don't have it's an important piece on that first offer to understand where the money's coming from. Do they have it already? Is it in the bank? Do they already have a line of credit and they just got to pull it, or do they actually have to go raise the money or take out a credit facility? And there's a risk then to the seller that might not go through, right? What if they don't get the money? And so that might be a reason why, as a seller, you'd want a reverse breakup fee to be compensated for, the expense of the deal and maybe beyond that, right?
Right. Eric, anything on this topic?
Yeah, well, piggybacking on what Brandy just said, a lot of times this reverse breakup fee or breakup fee issue ties back to momentum of the deal. And one of the reasons why it's more common in public deals is probably because public deals are usually done at a much faster pace than your typical venture-backed Silicon Valley style startup company. And another thing is, given that so the seller needs to think about whether it is wise to raise the issue of reverse breakup fee with the buyer earlier on in the LOI stage, because there is a good likelihood that the buyer will want to come back and say, hey, okay, so give me a breakup fee. That's number one. Number two is a lot of times that ties back to what we call a no-shop covenant, i.e. after the signing, the seller cannot go running around and solicit another offer from another potential acquirer. And sometimes there is that there are certain exceptions to this rule. For example, if the fiduciary duty of the board members require them to consider alternative proposals as well. So usually in these circumstances where an exception lies to the no-shop provision, that could be a trigger for reverse breakup fees or breakup fees alike.
Right. Great. Well, we're just about out of time. This is obviously a very deep and wide issue to try to discuss in a half an hour. But I think you guys have done a good job of kind of giving us some of the main things to think about. Brandy, any parting words?
I think the parting words really are: don't wait until you get an indication of interest to start thinking about your exit and the things that you need to do to be ready. You start from day one. Start from the first day you start your company. You want to be thinking about it when you negotiate your agreements, so you don't have to worry about going to get a consent from a third party when it comes time to sell the company. You want to think about it in the way that you're setting up compensation for your employees, making sure they're incented, making sure they're protected, keeping your company clean. So it's be prepared and think about it from day one.
Good. Eric?
So I would say, talk to your lawyers, your tax advisors, of course, what Brandy just said. Maybe also think about doing things right at first. For example, all these formation documents is super important to get them right. The cap table is super important to get them right. And also think about the financial statements. For example, if you're currently using cash accounting, whether there's a need to switch to GAAP, and what does that entail? Do we need to provide audited financial statements if they're not already available? So start thinking early and start talking with different advisors, and they'll give you advice on how to prepare for it. And if you talk to your counsel, I'm sure your counsel will talk to you about the various things that we can start, to clean up the company. For example, if there's any employee or contractor who hasn't signed an assignment agreement, those are the kind of work that we can forload to the front to ensure that there won't be a situation where one employee who's probably never touched the lucrative part of the company's products, all of a sudden they come forward and say, hey, you can't close without my signatures to the assignment agreement. Now I want $50,000. Otherwise, I'm not going to sign it.
Right. Yeah. So I can sum up my advice to any company founder on this whole topic, which is that during a financing or doing an M&A transaction, everything's going to come tumbling out of the closet. And so you want to have all of this stuff as absolutely tidy as possible. I wrote a post on Medium about a cap table mistake that cost me $130,000 out of my pocket because we were right in the middle of a M&A transaction, and turns out I had made a promise to somebody that I had never entered on the cap table, and I had to kind of personally fix it in order to get the deal closed. And so I wrote a Medium post about it so that others can learn from my mistakes.
That's very kind of you.
All right, Eric and Brandy, this has been a terrific discussion, conversation. Thank you so much. Really lucky to have two attorneys who specialize in M&A transactions being willing to join us this morning to share some thoughts. So thanks to the two of you very much.
The pleasure is
Thanks for having
ours.
us. Yeah.
And next week in this series, we're going to talk about employment law stuff.
Ooh, good one.
Which, this falls into the category of get everything right the first time so that it doesn't come tumbling out of the closet later.
Absolutely.
So next week, we'll discuss that. Thanks again, you guys. See you soon.
Thank you, Brett.
Thanks. Bye-bye.